On this episode of Newt's World, when I last had my two guests on, it was June 2nd, and an unbelievable amount has changed. For me personally, I could never have projected, I've written a whole bunch of alternative histories, I could not have invented from June 2nd to today. So I wanted to have these two experts back just to get a flavor from some really experienced guys, two of the most experienced and well-known pollsters in the Democrat and Republican parties. John McLaughlin, the CEO and partner at McLaughlin and Associates, a national survey, research, and strategic services company. He's worked professionally as a strategic consultant and pollster for over 35 years, and he's worked as an advisor and pollster for President Donald Trump. And Doug Sosnik. Doug played a key role as an advisor to President Bill Clinton from 1994 to 2000. Doug played a key role in policy, strategy, political and communications decisions in the White House. He has advised multiple U.S. senators, governors, Fortune 100 corporations, foundations, and universities for 35 years. John and Doug, I want to welcome you back. Could either of you have imagined the last 7 weeks?
Actually, Newt, it's like one of your historical novels. Like, you couldn't have even thought of this plot when you think about it. The idea of everything that's gone on. You know, when you talk about the national polls, like we publish a national poll, what's really interesting to me is, because we're going to end up talking about polls, is that we put out a poll the day before the debate in June. And Trump won the debate handily. And Doug sent me some polls after it. But you think about it, he won the debate. The Democrats are calling for his withdrawal. He then survives an assassin's bullet. He then has a Republican convention where the party's totally transformed. It's the party of Trump. They're united behind him. And that Sunday after it, Joe Biden withdraws and handpicks Kamala Harris as his successor. So the poll we did the day before the debate, Trump was up 2. And he always argues with me why I'm not up more. And I'm like, it's modeled after the 2020 turnout. Certain amount of Democrats, certain amount of liberals, you're never getting their votes. It's close. The poll we did after Kamala Harris came in at the beginning of August, Trump's up 2. And like Doug's been saying, you know, you got to wait till after Labor Day, after the conventions and everything. But I'm not sure there's that much movement in the electorate, one way or the other.
But, you know, if you look at the political press, which, of course, has to write something every day. And if you're 24-hour cable news, you have to think up something every hour. There's been all this turmoil, all this excitement. Biden collapses in the debate. Will he or will he not get off the ticket? Callista walked in and said to me, Joe Biden just withdrew. And I said, this is Babylon B, right? She said, no. 2 or 3 hours later, Kamala Harris, who we all knew couldn't possibly run, is not only running, she's got his endorsement, and she's the nominee. I've never seen anything like it for being a roller coaster. But Doug, what's your experience of the last 6 or 7 weeks?
First of all, I absolutely could never have predicted where we'd be today. I, however, would say that at the beginning of 2023, I thought having a Trump-Biden rematch was defying the laws of political gravity. So I did think something was going to happen. In fact, I wrote something at the end of 2023 about the race where I started talking about Lyndon Johnson getting out. Now, I was probably a little too wimpy, and I was implicitly suggesting Biden get out, but I didn't say it out loud. But I didn't predict it. But I wanted to just, if I could, build on what John said a minute ago. Everything is different about this race than it was. On the other hand, in a lot of ways, a lot hasn't changed. And if you take October, early November of 2023 until the debate, the 6-7 months, that was a very consistent race. Trump was ahead narrowly, but it was a durable lead, both nationally and in the battleground states, despite the fact that, you know, Biden had a job approval in the 30s. You had almost 70% of the country said we're headed in the wrong direction. And we had a stable race where Biden was really, prior to the debate, you know, I wouldn't say it's 50-50, but he certainly shot at winning. You've now had, with Biden's withdrawal and Harris's sort of like a tornado that swept through, I think she is ahead now, but I think that now's not the time to really assess where the race stands, and we can talk about that in polling in a minute. despite the fact that I don't think Harris has lost a single news cycle in the last month. She is like a tornado. Having said all that, the race is close, and it's within a couple points, and it's the same states that are going to determine the outcome. I think that there's maybe a little bit of over-exuberance on the Democratic side. If nothing else, we're coming out of like a profound period of depression with Biden at the top of the ticket. But I think the race is a lot closer than maybe what your rank-and-file Democrat or what your mainstream media person is depicting right now.
It's almost like the country has polarized into these two tribes, and all you need to know is who's the leader of my tribe. I'm for him. Now tell me what else is going on. Do you sort of sense that the country in that sense has frozen into a tribalism that makes thinking about winning the elections different than it would have been? I've been around so long. I mean, I look at examples like Reagan, Carter, or like George H.W. Bush, Dukakis. I'm not sure we have the fluidity that we had back then. The two tribes may be pretty decisively structured, but what do you two think?
I think you're right. It's we're seeing less swing voters and less movement where all of a sudden you could have Reagan winning with 60% of the vote. Doesn't look possible now in the electorate because there's an Obama coalition that got built when he won in 2008 that was really a new Democratic coalition where it was based on a maximum turnout of minority support. It was based on attracting Latinos, based on transitioning college-educated voters into the Democratic Party. And it was also based on younger voters. And the Democrats have been working the younger voters. I mean, we used to do polling for MTV when Bush was president, et cetera. We were the token Republicans. But the Democrats, that was the one cohort they would win, the voters under 30, et cetera. And Bush, when you look at his win over Kerry, it was only 51-48, and that's the last majority Republican win. And there were lots of wrong polls then, too. But Trump, when he won the Republican campaign with his positions on trade and immigration, represented a transformation in the Republican campaign in opposite to the Obama coalition. So the Trump coalition, we were going to bring out new voters who were in the heartland of America. They were from the Rust Belt and the Sun Belt, and they were the ones who, during the 8 years of Obama, kind of got hurt badly. And then after COVID and then after Biden, Trump was attracting pieces of the Obama coalition. The Biden 2020 voter who became a Trump 24 voter was a quarter black, quarter Hispanic, average age was 35. And they were still working class voters that they were attracted to the Republican Party, that the Republican Party's become the working class voter. And in Doug's writings, he's talked about how you have the smallest share of the electorate that the white working class voter now. But they're still significant in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. And Trump, his ability to win in 2016, when he said, how are we going to win? We're losing to all these polls to Hillary Clinton. I said, you know, a lot of voters didn't vote for Mitt Romney. They walked away. Only 130 million voted. There was 90 million voters who were eligible who didn't vote. I said, we're going to bring out new voters, these casual Republican voters. And they were the ones who, it wasn't an Obama voter who switched to Trump that created the 208 pivot counties. It was new voters coming in that we had 9 million more voters than the Romney-Obama fight. But then David Plouffe in 2020 took it to a new level where the Democrat strategy was based on not winning battleground states, battleground counties within the battleground states, where they registered voters who would have been Hillary voters and then made it easier for them to vote. And now he's running the Harris campaign with Axelrod's TV firm. So the Republicans are not only up against a new candidate, but they're up against a strategic team that has changed American politics before.
One of the big changes when Biden leaves is you now do get the Obama team, which Biden wouldn't use. And I think they're remarkably better than the team that Biden had. Doug, what's your sense of the degree to which polarization limits the potential swing in vote support?
First of all, the Obama team is far better than the Biden team. And secondly, John, it's actually been 7 out of the last 8 presidential elections. The Republicans have not gotten the majority of the votes. And I think that lies one of the problems and the challenges the Democrats have right now, which is the Electoral College. And I think it is favoring the Republicans. In terms of two Americas, we are in two Americas. And I think all you have to do really is just look at 20 minutes of the Republican convention a month ago with the sound off, and just look at 20 minutes of the Democratic convention this week without the sound off. And you'd think we're in two completely different countries based on that. And we are right now in tribes, and it is frozen for now. And I think the two best predictors, one is John's alluded to, which is the level of education people have. And Republicans are now more of a working class party. For the first time in the last election, white working class voters constituted less than 40% of the vote. However, in the three industrial Midwestern states, they constitute over 50% of the vote. When we were all starting in politics, Democrats did better in presidential years and Republicans in off years because occasional voters were Democrats. Well, now occasional voters are Republican. So the two best predictors, well, there's one best predictor for sure, which is education, which John mentioned. And that's part of, I think, how that is now transcending even race since the 2012 Romney campaign, that how Trump has been doing so much better with Hispanic voters. And it really does cut by education levels. But the second issue, or second factor, which I think is going to be more pronounced in this election than it has in any election, is the gender gap, which has been existing in American politics since the 1980 Reagan campaign. But I think this is going to be a historic gender gap, both because of the nature of the Harris candidacy, but also the nature of the Trump candidacy. And the last thing I'll say, we are frozen, and we will stay frozen until this generation, our generation, moves off the political scene. I do think when we have the millennials and the Gen Zs taking over our country, I think that we will unfreeze this cultural divide that really started in the 1960s.
When you go down to governorships, in both sides, you see people who win huge victories as governor, Democrats and Republicans. And then, of course, you get up to the national level, it sort of evens out because all the states where the Democrats win huge margins tend to be for the Democrats. And the states where the Republicans, like DeSantis's margin in Florida, which when I was first in politics, it was inconceivable that you'd have Florida as a basically Republican state. But the changes have been that profound.
That's all driven by how the tribalism, that's all driven by education level. So 40 out of 50 states are controlled by one political party, overwhelmingly controlled by one political party, I might add, 40 out of 50 states. That's this tribalism, which right now, the single best predictor of where a community falls politically is the level of education of people in that community.
Which is also a remarkable shift from, say, 1960, when you would have thought education meant that the Republicans were carrying college and graduate school level, and Democrats were carrying high school and two-year college level.
It started somewhat with Clinton, but it really started in the 2000s. John mentioned about the Obama coalition in 2008, and there was one major component of the Obama coalition in 2008 that has moved to Trump and the Republicans and stayed there. And that's white working class people. So you had 206 counties in the United States that voted for Obama in 2008, Obama in 2012, and voted for Trump in 2016. 206 counties. Now in 2020, only 26 of them went to Biden. And so that coalition that was part of the Obama coalition was overwhelmingly white, non-college, older voters in the areas of the country hardest hit by globalization and trade with China. That part of the Obama coalition is now firmly the core of the Republican Party, which really started politically. It first showed up in American politics. Remember, as we all know, politics is a lagging indicator of what's going on in our country. It's not a leading indicator. And so the first time it showed up politically was in 1992 with Pat Buchanan's primary against Bush, and then the Perot candidacy where he got almost 20 million votes.
If you looked at the two conventions, the Republican convention is a post-revolutionary convention in terms of who's there. President Bush is not there. Vice President Cheney's not there. Vice President Pence is not there. There is really a profound shift in who shows up at the Republican convention. If you look at the Democratic convention, the entire machine's there. I mean, nobody's missing. And I just thought it was a very interesting comment on change in the two parties and the whole notion that, in a sense, the establishment intervened in 2020 to block Sanders, then they accepted Biden, and then they decided right after the Biden-Trump debate that Biden would lose, so they intervened to replace Biden. All of this, of course, in the name of democracy.
But there are two factors there, Newt. There are two factors to that phenomenon, which I agree with. The first factor is the Republican Party has now completed a political transformation where it's a party of Trump. So for we Democrats, for 25 years, every 4 years, we had a convention to try to figure out what are we going to do about Jimmy Carter. I mean, we don't want him to show up, but we can't not invite him. So, how do we deal with Jimmy Carter? We've got all these pre-Trump generation of Republican politicians. Nobody wants them there, and they don't want to be there. That's one factor of what you said. But the other factor is that this party of Trump right now is really, I don't want to sound too partisan. I would have used the term cult, but that's probably a little too edgy.
Doug, on this podcast, you can use any word you want.
The politics of personality is driving right now. The Republican Party is a party of transformation, is now the party of Trump. I do think the personality of Trump is taking over a lot of the oxygen of the party.
You got to give credit to Newt, because Newt, transformed the country. I was lucky because Bill McCollum and Haley Barbour had paid for a survey in September of 94 that I got to deliver to the Republican House leadership. And it was in the bowels of the Capitol with the minority party and Bob Michaels there. I'm delivering the poll, and I said, it's September of 94, and I've got a poll where the generic vote has the Republicans up 7 for Congress. And I've never seen that before in all the years. And I wasn't that long a pollster, but I worked for Finkelstein before I went on my own. I've never seen that before. And I'm like, we're going to win the majority. But Newt won that majority, and still he was part of that. And now he's still at the convention. When I got there, I said, do you know what the difference is? The country club's not running the party anymore. The caddies are. And it's the Republican Party with Trump transforming it. Here's this blue-collar billionaire who is not from politics, who doesn't play by the rules, and he really doesn't believe in the polls as much as his gut. Sometimes his gut's wrong, but a lot of times it's right. His ability to identify with working-class voters who the Democrats know they may or may not come into the process. Just before I got on the call, I'm looking at an economist poll comes out. Okay, they got Harris up 3. Go to the demographics, and they have Republicans at 28% of their sample, and the Democrats at 38. And I'm like, the last exit polls were 2020, 37, 36, 2016, 36, 33. We haven't been under 30% of the electorate going back to the 20th century, when you would have swings of conservative Democrats into the Republican Party. But that's a bygone era. That's the Reagan era.
John, two things. First of all, the undersampling by pollsters of white working class voters has been a problem since Donald Trump first ran. And that's why there's always a surprise on Election Day based on the polling, because of the undersampling of actual turnout. The other couple of things I'll say, I do agree that Trump has a unique appeal to blue-collar workers. I would hardly call him a blue-collar background candidate. And the last thing I'll say, Newt, you probably take this as a compliment, actually. Although when I normally give a speech and say what I'm getting to say, it's not intended as a compliment. But we have essentially began at the late 1980s, the weaponization of American politics. And that's what changed. That's what's changed our politics, was the weaponization of everything in politics. And the two events that I hold most responsible for that was, one was the Democrats' handling of the Bork hearing, in which they set a new standard in which there's no such thing as anything sacrosanct in terms of our ability to politicize everything. And the other new was you're taking over the House Republicans and winning the Congress. And so I consider it a bipartisan group effort. And I always frame you as one of the godfathers of that, but not in a partisan way, but as just a way that our country and politics changed.
I cheerfully plead guilty. If you're a minority party and you've been in the wilderness for 40 years, you had better figure out how to be tough enough to draw a line that will get you elected. I wrote a whole book on this called March to the Majority. If you're the majority party, you want to blur the differences, and then you get to remain the majority party. If you're an effective minority party, you want to maximize the differences, and that way you might actually emerge. So, Doug, I think your analysis is right. And I do think Bork and then Clarence Thomas, and from the narrow standpoint of the House, stealing Indiana 9 in 1984 was a seminal event, which suddenly we said, if the Democrats will do that, then there are no holds barred. I'm fascinated in the crosstabs, and I'd like to get you two to comment. Black males have stuck with Trump to a much greater extent than you would have expected, given the nomination of a black nominee. But she clearly has solidified black women. But my sense is she has not, in fact, solidified black males. I mean, do either of you have a comment on that phenomenon?
Well, I've seen recent polling over the weekend where some states she hasn't quite solidified the black women yet because they're still going to the store, paying high prices on inflation. There's still problems, real problems that real people are facing that she doesn't have the answer to. And what's interesting is she's part of the elites. Symbolically, yes, she happens to be an African-American woman, but she's part of the elites. And black men, it's even worse for them. And Biden, during his 4 years, it was going to appoint a black woman as vice president. I'm going to appoint a black woman to the Supreme Court. Black men, I don't know. They were just getting less attention and less connection, and they're dealing with real problems. And for years, and Doug's been part of these wars with the governor's races. You know, George Allen, when he got elected governor in 93, we got over 20% of the black vote. And Jim Gilmore, but it was on real things about, like, we were ending parole and we were fighting crime and no car tax. Nathan Deal, when he got reelected governor in 2014 in Georgia, we had done the drug courts and the version of the First Step Act first before Trump ever did it. And we went after or tried to appeal to African-American voters. And there was a profile. There was a middle-class black voter who felt the same alienation that white voters feel, and they had more in common in terms of, yeah, sure, they're members of law enforcement, they're members of, they're veterans, they want their kids to go to a charter school. They had a demographic that you could say, they're going to vote with Republicans. And, you know, Nathan Deal and then Casey Cagle in Georgia, we got over 20% of the black vote. And Trump has been connecting with African-American voters who they know that their real wealth has gone down, their situation's not been as good. And you've got a country where, yeah, our last national poll, 75% said it's on the wrong track, 62% say the economy's getting worse, 50% they can't afford basic necessities. Even though they're dicing the parties based on race and age and all these other demographics, education, there's common problems that if the Trump campaign and the Republicans talk about the issues and talk about the solutions, we have a real opportunity to beat Kamala Harris. Like, I agree with Doug. Let's wait till after Labor Day. Let's wait till the debate. You know, they're trying to run a character race that's more about style and vibes and run away from kind of the current issues. They had Joe Biden at the convention speak after 11:30. It's amazing the way that they're trying to, like, she's not the vice president. She's not responsible for any of these things. She hasn't been his partner for 3.5 years. It's like she's sitting there at the convention. You're watching her on TV and you're like, it's unbelievable. She didn't win a single primary, didn't win a caucus. And poor Joe, see you bye. And he's not coming back to the convention. And the 3.5 years in the past are his problem and not hers.
I do agree with John's point. I think what's been underreported is the fact that since 2012, after Obama was no longer on the ballot, the support for Democrats with blacks has gone down. And in fact, in 2020, Biden ran behind Clinton with blacks. So there are two issues in terms of the black vote. And I do think it's really largely confined to males and younger males in particular, and probably non-college younger males. The two issues for Democrats. One is, if they're going to vote for Harris, are they actually going to turn out and vote? And if you look at the 2020 results, turnout, even in Atlanta and Philadelphia and Detroit, these big cities, the turnout was down. But secondly, Trump is running better with these voters now than he was in 2020. Now, he's not probably running as well with these voters now as he was 2 months ago when Biden was on the ticket, but he still is outperforming how he did with these voters in 2020.
I get the sense that with all of the news media effort and all of the fluff, this is still a real race. Back in June, we couldn't have predicted all the different things that have happened since then. The truth is, from now to Election Day, a lot of things could happen, and that it has not refrozen in a definable pattern at this stage. Is that a fair summary?
You have a friend, Brent Bozell, who runs the Media Research Center. Brent just put out a study where they covered the mainstream media networks and the cable networks from July 21st to August 17th, that 84% of the coverage for Harris has been positive. So it goes to Doug's point about her winning the news cycle, like every day, every hour. 89% of the Trump coverage has been negative. And Brent did a poll with us a week ago where he had 1,200 registered Democrats and independent Biden voters. Independents who voted for Biden in 2020 were 800 Democrats. And he asked them, are you aware or not aware that Harris supported cutting funding to the police? 71% not aware. Aware that she never visited a conflict zone on the border as the borders are? 72% not aware. She doesn't consider it a crime to enter the U.S. illegally? 74% not aware. Most liberal senator in 2019 in the U.S. Senate. 75% not aware. She supported elimination of private health insurance. 81% not aware. So the real campaign hasn't really started. Through the Democrat convention, you've got this extended honeymoon. She made one press availability where she said she wanted to have an arms embargo on Israel, and then they reeled that back in. And then she did do the speech last week where she talked about price controls. So I think the real issue part of the campaign is beginning. And then I look at the convention last night and what happened with Trump with the black journalists. They really want to try to bait Trump into blowing up. They want to say, just like Joe Biden in the debate, Joe Biden called him a racist, mentioned the porn star, called him a convicted felon. And Biden's speech, to the extent it was late at night, was the same kind of untruths and attacks on Trump. And the one debate Harris has agreed to, I'm sure she's going to try to get him to say something that she can portray as racist and something that's misogynistic. So on the intellectual level, we've got these two coalitions, we've got all these issues. But on a stylistic personality level, the Democrats, they play hardball.
John and I are in the business of trying to win elections. We're not working for the Columbia Journalism Review, and we're not working for the Institute for the Free Press of America. And I, as a Democrat, delighted how much press Trump does. I wish he would do a press conference every day. And I think I would say two things about the press. One is the mainstream press, and I said this on a podcast the other day, and I became the darling of the right-wing media. The mainstream press has a bias for Democrats, and they hate Trump. But the mainstream press, what's more important to them than that is covering a story and feeling like they're treated right. And generally, the candidate who has the mainstream press on their side wins, and it's not always the Democrat. I would say in 2004, the press at the end thought Kerry was a big phony. And when they didn't like Bush and agree with him, I think they thought he was at least the real thing. I think in 2016, the mainstream press, they bought into the Trump narrative about crooked Hillary and all the rest of it. And I think they turned on Biden. They turned on Biden when they thought that they had been misled and mistreated about his actual health. So it's not an automatic that they're going to support and be in the tank for Democrats, but they clearly are beside themselves with joy that Harris is running against Trump.
I used to have a ground rule. If you're a House Republican back in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, you didn't get any coverage. I mean, you didn't exist in terms of national media. But one of the theories that I developed was the press is like a great white shark. that if something bleeds, they will eat it. They may feel bad eating it if it's a liberal Democrat, but they can't help themselves. When we went after Jim Wright for ethics problems and he ultimately had to resign as Speaker, I knew that once they caught the scent, even though they would much prefer Wright over me, that the scent that there was something there, they would just start chewing and they couldn't back off.
Two things about that, Newt. First of all, what you did do long before you took over the House in 94, what you did really for the first time since the early 1950s, you made the House Republican minority relevant. And you can't be part of the conversation if you're not part of the conversation. So whether it's Jim Wright's books or whatever it is, you forced your way into the conversation. The second thing, going back to your question about the race and where we stand. So I think Harris is ahead. I think she's ahead right now, close to outside the margin of error in the majority of the battleground states and nationally. My guess is at the beginning of next week, she'll be in a stronger position than she is today. However, I think by the period probably around Labor Day or slightly thereafter, prior to the September 10th debate, my guess is that the race is going to settle back down to a more practical number where I think she'll be ahead, but it's all kind of within the margins. And I think there are two very conflicting forces here about the race. One I've mentioned several times, I'll mention again, which is the advantage that Republicans have in how we elect presidents through the Electoral College. It is an enormous advantage. The Electoral College is 6 votes more favorable to Trump now after the last reapportionment and redistricting based on census than it was in 2020. The Electoral College map really favors Republicans. And the second thing, which I think is the most significant thing that I'm looking at in polling, I kind of glance at these polls right now, but I do feel like it's sort of not really that important because, as I said earlier, this is kind of not for real, but you can't ignore them. But what I've seen consistently, which I think is the biggest problem for Trump, is that the majority of our country has never supported Donald Trump. The majority of the country, never one day as president did he have a 50% job approval. He never got 47% of the popular vote in 2016 or 2020. Of all the battleground states, the only battleground state that he ever got 50% of the vote in was Georgia in 2016. So the fact of the matter is, the more it's a two-person race, the worse 46 point whatever percent of the vote looks. And you're seeing a cratering of the third party. If you look at the Siena New York Times polls that came out in the 3 battleground states, all 3 said Harris is up by 4. But to me, what was most relevant to that was all 3 polls, he was at 46% of the vote. And I think that's going to be the biggest challenge, John, you have in your campaign, particularly if you're seeing this cratering of third parties, is how do you deal in a 2-person race to get a majority of people in this country to support someone who they never in 7 years have done?
When Republicans win, it's not because Republicans are great. It's most often because the voters reject the Democrats. And having grown up in New York and making a career of winning in New York, I got all the scars. But the only time you Republicans win is when you get enough Democrats and independents to reject Democrat failure. Because even when you go back to the 80s, when it was a 2-majority system, you had a Democrat partisan majority, you had a conservative ideological majority. Now it's come closer. But last night the speeches were about rhetoric and not about, real results. But that's a challenge for Trump. And your point about the polls you're citing, I've been through this before twice in 2016 and 2014. The week before Election Day in 2016, I was telling Hannity we could win because I had actual polls modeled on real turnout models. And we knew we were going to try to bring out some of these casual voters. It's going to be very close, and the same thing on Election Day. But you had 538 saying 71% say we're going to lose, et cetera. And then in 2020, it was the same thing. I was saying it was going to be close, and we lost by 44,000 votes out of the 160 million in 3 states, basically. But you look at the polls that you're citing, in Wisconsin, the CNN exit poll had 37% Republican. The New York Times poll this week had 27% Republican. It's a 10-point difference. In Michigan, it was a 9-point difference where they underpolled Republicans. Your turnouts, they're discounting Republican and Trump voters again. The July 4th weekend, I looked at their polls when they were putting it out after the Biden debate. I'm like, these polls are too good. I do have an MBA in statistics, and you're looking at the models and you're saying, it doesn't look like an actual turnout database. It doesn't look like past histories.
Let me say two things to that. First of all, forget the polls. Just look at the voting in 2016 and 2020. Look at the voting in 2016 and 2020, and look at the Trump vote nationally and in the battleground states, period. Second thing is, there are only three things I care about when I'm running a campaign. I want to define what the campaign's about. I want to define my candidate, and I want to define my opponent. And prior to Biden's withdrawal, this campaign was a referendum of the Trump presidency versus the Biden presidency. Trump was strong, Biden was weak. That's why the Biden guys wanted an early debate, because they knew they were heading to a loss. Now in the new order, you guys are losing the debate about what this campaign's about. You are losing, it's not over, you're losing the battle to define Harris, and you're hardening the silo of reminding people, the majority of people, why they voted against Trump in 2020. You had a spectacular convention all the way through Thursday night, through the first 30 minutes of Trump's speech when he was reading off the teleprompter. But his last hour of riffing and every single battle for who won the day, Trump is hardening the silo of his negative narrative. And all the money he spent making age an issue about Biden is now becoming a problem for him against a woman who's 19 years younger than him, Trump, who's an unbelievable political specimen. He's not the same guy he was 7 years ago. He's not the same guy he was 3.5 years ago. And don't take my word for it. All you got to do is watch him.
I'm just going back to the point is like, I think the real campaign's coming now, and ideologically and results oriented. You know, most of the voters that are going to decide the race in the middle, they don't look in terms of ideology. They don't look in terms of partisan lenses. They're like, is my life going to get better? Are the things that bother me now, whether it's inflation, whether it's they're worried about their jobs again, the economy's not really picking up, there's not real growth. Are things going to get better? And that's the challenge to President Trump. And that's the challenge to the campaign over the next 10 weeks, in effect, for the Trump campaign. But
this is something that Trump understood and understands, and Newt understood and understands, which is the way you win elections is to connect with people's heart, not their head. Now, you can talk about stuff policy-wise, but that's not the game. The game is the emotional connection with a voter. And that's what Trump has been spectacular at until now. And now, currently, he's losing the battle of the emotional connection of what's going on in this campaign. Harris, I've said it elsewhere, in my lifetime, there have been three movement politicians. Reagan, Obama in 2008. I don't think he was a movement politician in 2012, but he was in 2008. And Trump. And movements are bigger than campaigns. And if you get to a movement, no one's going to care about the white paper and this issue and that issue. And I'm not sitting here today and telling you that Harris is running a political movement now instead of a campaign. What I am telling you is she's moving towards that, and she may become that. And if she becomes that, there's no way to stop it.
I think you just defined, the two of you, sort of the core of where we're at. If Trump does his job right, then Harris can't possibly end up being a movement leader. And if Harris does her job right, then she probably can't be stopped. And I think that's why the next 6 weeks are going to be fascinating. I really appreciate you two. It's such a great, sophisticated, and knowledgeable conversation. I hope maybe sometime around the end of September, we can tempt the two of you into one more round of this. And then after the election, maybe we'll get one round of G. I wish we had known that. Whatever happens, because that's the nature of the business. But I want to thank both of you. This has been really fascinating. You guys are so knowledgeable. And I do want to let our listeners know we're going to have links to the latest polls on our show page at newtsworld.com. But I thank both of you for taking the time to join us.
Happy to do it.
Thank you, because I learn a lot listening to yourself and Doug. So the education goes on, and we're going to need it over the next 10 weeks, that's for sure.
Thank you to my guests, John McLaughlin and Doug Sosnik. You can learn more about the state of the election on our show page at newtsworld.com. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Pendley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcast and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newt's World can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.